Dreams based on domination are by definition limited dreams. Wes Jackson reminds us of how these two forms of domination come together in the United States when he tells us, quote, "We are still more the cultural descendants of Columbus and Coronado than we are of the natives we replaced." Citing the writer Wendell Berry, Jackson points out that as we came across the continent, cutting the forests and plowing the prairies, we never knew what we were doing because we never knew what we were undoing. Dreams based on domination by people over the non-human world are dreams only for the short term. Dreams based on domination by some people over others are dreams only for the privileged. As Malcolm X put it, I see America through the eyes of the victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare. So, a world, I'm arguing, that is based on domination and subordination is inevitably a profoundly unjust world and a fundamentally unsustainable world. So let's talk a bit about those two ideas. This is the state of our unjust world. According to World Bank statistics, a third of the people on the planet live on less than $2 per day, US, while half of the people on the planet live on less than $2.50 a day. That means at least half the people in this world cannot meet basic expenditures for the food, clothing, shelter, health, and education necessary for a minimally decent life. Now, concern about this is not confined to radical idealists. Consider the judgment of James Wolfenson made during near the end of his term as president of the World Bank. Wolfenson said, "It is time to take a cold, hard look at the future. Our planet is not balanced. Too few control too much, and many have too little to hope for. Too much turmoil, too many wars, too much suffering. The demographics of the future speak to a growing imbalance of people, resources, and the environment. If we act together now, we can change the world for the better. If we do not, we shall leave greater and more intractable problems for our children." Let's take a moment to consider the state of our unsustainable world. Look at any measure of the health of the ecosystems of this continent. I don't care what measure you look at. Groundwater depletion, topsoil loss, chemical contamination, increased toxicity in our own bodies, the number and size of dead zones in the oceans, accelerating extinction of species, and the reduction of biodiversity. All suggest we may be past the point of restoration. This warning comes from 1,700 of the world's leading scientists, who said, "Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future that we wish for human society and the plant and animal kingdoms, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about." That statement was issued in 1992, and in the past 2 decades, it's hard to see evidence that we have changed course. As a result of this, these days, if somebody comes to me and asks for my support for an idea or a project or an institution of some sort, I ask, will these things make some contribution to the struggle for justice and sustainability? That's my benchmark question. No one idea, project, or institution, of course, is going to solve all our problems, and perhaps even no combination of them can save us. But I think this is a reasonable question to ask of everything in our lives. On those criteria, the American dream does not fare so well. I have concluded that the American dream is inconsistent with social justice and ecological sustainability. So I'm against the American dream. I don't want to rescue, redefine, or renew the American dream. I want us all to recognize the need to transcend the domination-subordination dynamic at the heart of the American dream. And if we can manage that, the dream would fade, as dreams do, when we awaken and come into consciousness. Now, that's my principled argument. Let's consider some questions about political and rhetorical strategy, because, of course, these are important considerations. So let me start by telling you a story about a phone call I got sometime around the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Phone call came from a New York Times reporter who was working on a piece about the anti-war movement's attempt to rally folks around the idea that peace is patriotic. Remember those bumper stickers? Peace is patriotic. Hate those bumper stickers. I always did. And he asked my opinion. And I told him that I never used the phrase, and in fact that I routinely argued against the concept of patriotism. Instead of trying to redefine patriotism, I wanted to abandon the concept as intellectually, politically, and morally indefensible. So this reporter from the New York Times was intrigued, and he asked me to explain. Now, no, this was the first, and so far the only time, I've been interviewed by a New York Times reporter. And so even though I know the reporter is the newspaper, it's a tool of the ruling class, that's well known, I still couldn't help but want to make a good impression. So first I pointed out that critiques of patriotism at this fundamental level have been being made by radicals in the past for quite a long time, and there was nothing all that new in what I was going to say. And then I explained my argument, which is contained in one of the books I wrote called Citizens of the Empire. And he listened patiently and then said he couldn't see a hole in the argument, but that it didn't really matter. He said, no one's going to buy that. And so my position, no matter how compelling, as you can imagine, didn't end up in his story. Now, perhaps I can take some solace in knowing that he thought my argument was correct. But it's not enough just to be correct. We want also to be effective. So the question I think we should ask is an argument irrelevant if it can't be communicated widely in mainstream culture? And is that the fate of any assault on the idea of an American dream? Well, it's certainly true that the American dream is a deeply rooted part of the ideology of superiority of the dominant culture. And I think there's evidence all around that this ideology is more deeply entrenched than ever, perhaps precisely because the decline of American power and wealth is so obvious and people are scared and scrambling. But just because an idea can't be easily communicated to the mainstream, I think does not mean we should avoid such radical critiques and simply water things down to play to the mainstream. In fact, I believe this is a time when such critiques are more important than ever. Now, that analysis stems from an assessment of the political terrain on which I think we operate today. I would argue this is not a mass movement moment in American history. Not a time in which large numbers of Americans are likely to engage in political activity that challenges basic systems of power and wealth. I believe we are in a period in which the most important work is creating the organizations and networks that will be important in the future, when the political conditions will change, for better or worse. Whatever is coming, we are going to need sharper analysis, stronger vehicles for action, and more resilient connections among people. In short, I think this is a cadre building moment in history. Now, although for some people the phrase cadre building may invoke the worst of the left's revolutionary dogmatism, I have something different in mind than that tradition. For me, cadre does not mean vanguard or self-appointed bearers of truth who annoy you endlessly in every meeting. Instead, I think it signals commitment, but with an openness to rethinking theory and practice. And I don't believe I'm being unrealistic here. I see this kind of organizing in groups that I know of in Austin, right here. We've talked about some of them. Third Coast Workers for Cooperation, the Workers' Defense Project, Monkey Wrench Books. Perhaps not surprisingly, these are groups that tend to be led by younger people who are drawing on long-standing radical ideas, updating as needed to fit a changing world. The organizers in this world that I know reject the ideology that comforts the dominant culture. The old folks, which I define as anyone my age and older, 52, the old folks who are useful in these endeavors, I think also are willing to leave behind these chauvinistic stories about American greatness. So to openly challenge the American dream is to signal that we are not afraid to, number one, tell the truth, and number two, keep working in face of significant impediments. This kind of challenge speaks to those who are hungry for honest talk about the depth of our problems and are yearning to be part of a community that perseveres without illusions. That isn't a majority of the American population, maybe not yet even a significant minority. But those are the people, I think, who have the resolve that we need. So back to the patriotism critique. Despite the popularity of those pieces patriotic bumper stickers, I have continued to offer my argument against the concept of patriotism. And whenever I speak about it in a lecture, people tell me that it was helpful to hear that position articulated in public. Over and over on this and other issues, I hear people saying that they've had such thoughts themselves, but have felt isolated, and that hearing the critique in public shores up their sense that they are not crazy. Perhaps these kinds of more radical analyses don't change the course of existing movements in the moment, but I do think they help bolster those who are at the core of more radical movements that we need, and they do help us identify each other. So, a second strategic consideration. Although a radical critique of the American dream isn't likely to land in the New York Times any more than a radical critique of patriotism, I don't think we should ignore the ways we can use such arguments for outreach to liberal and sometimes even conservative communities. Once again, let me give you an example from this question of patriotism. I have had conversations with conservative Christians who are typically among the most hyper-patriotic Americans, in which I've challenged them to square that patriotism with their Christian faith. Isn't patriotism simply a form of idolatry? I ask. Now, I can't claim to have converted large numbers to the anti-empire, anti-capitalist critique yet, but as the evangelicals say, we sometimes make progress one by one from within. One by one from within, brothers and sisters. But framing questions in a way that forces people to see that conventional politics is at odds with their most deeply held moral principles is a potentially effective strategy in some cases. It doesn't always work, because we all know that humans, including all of us, are known for our ability to hold contradictory ideas at the same time. But I do think this is one resource in a organizer's toolkit. So we might consider critiquing the American dream by contrasting it with another widely embraced idea, the Golden Rule, or the ethic of reciprocity, which says we should treat others as we would like to be treated. That principle shows up in virtually all religious teachings and secular philosophy. In Christianity, Jesus phrased it this way in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. So whatever you wish that someone would do to you, so do so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. One of the best known stories about the great Jewish scholar Hillel from the 1st century BCE concerns a man who, it was said, challenged him to teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. Hillel responded, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. This is echoed in the repeated biblical command in both the Hebrew Bible as well as the New Testament to, quote, love thy neighbor as thyself. In Islam, one of Prophet Muhammad's central teachings was, quote, none of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. In secular Western philosophy, Kant's categorical imperative is a widely invoked touchstone. Act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it shall become a universal law. Now on the surface, the American dream of success for all appears to be an articulation of the golden rule of equal opportunity for all.